So let's see. I'm sharing. Is it being able to? Like, is everybody seeing the slides?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, hello everyone. This is Gelson Pagan, and I was very excited when I got the invitation from Allison saying that the presentations were more for an opportunity to discuss about the future of the biobots. And while there are also many conversations to be had regarding the technologies themselves, I actually decided to take the opportunity to maybe reopen the philosophical conversation about emergence and hopefully offer what I consider to be an interesting spin on it. And the title and the topic of my short talk is Future of Biobots, Embracing Variability. And so my aim is to possibly extend an interesting perspective on variability with respect to emergence that might spark our imagination when thinking about the complexity of the system. And so now we have studied these systems in EBICS 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, and we have developed many platforms to assemble and explore these multicellular engineered living systems. Just to name a few, since we know there have been many, many more, in EBICS we have developed and studied walking biobots powered by skeletal muscle, a swimmer driven by signals through a neuromuscular junction communicating with the muscle, a pump bot capable of generating fluid by skeletal muscle contractions, platforms for neuromuscular disease models, and engineered topographies for improved innovation. And in the Bashir lab, we have even started looking into ways to engineer neural tissue with control of their shape, as well as explore alternative approaches to study learning and neural training in these tissues. But as we move forward, thinking about an imaginary EBICS Infinity 0.0, I would be pretty sure that among um, the top priorities in the field would be improved translation of biological concepts to our engineering systems, expansion of design principles, and an increase in repeatability. And this third aspect is what I would like to touch on today. And many times when we think of repeatability, we think of minimizing introduction of variability from multiple sources. But even if the system were automated to perform in a perfectly identical way, we would still intuitively still expect some variability, right? And that variability is the one that I would like to discuss. And this type of inherent variability, I recently learned actually discussed a lot in dynamic systems theory. And it basically suggests that erratic fluctuations in experiments could actually be derived from a rigidly deterministic relationship. Now, like I said, it will get a bit philosophical, but I hope that we can all get something out of it. Now, more formally, dynamic systems theory is the description and prediction of systems that exhibit complex changing behavior at the macroscopic level. In other words, it emerges from the collective actions from many interacting components. This applies to systems like the economy, but also a living system and the multiple multicellular complex systems that are our models. Now, one of the bases for the emergence of these behaviors is that these systems basically this non-linearity is what is mostly studied in this theory. So when we analyze nonlinear systems, let's say when analyzing population growth, for example, we know that the competition of different variables such as limitation of resources, death and birth rate, is what leads to nonlinearity. In dynamic systems theory, these parameters get lumped into a single number called R, which is basically like a control parameter. And for sake of argument, thinking about emergence, we can say that the control parameter R is the agglomeration of aspects that affect the emergence of a property, and that the X is the state of emergence of the system that could show the property. Now, in this model, it uses a function called the logistic map, shown in the equation here. And however, in the simplified model, the theory moves away from like trying to correlate the function to actual real world measurements and rather analyze the behavior of the function itself. And so let's do the same. And so let's say that R is given a value of 2. If the system starts at an initial state of x not equal to 0.2, then the system would stabilize at an x value of 0.5. For the same value of R, if you were to start at a value of 0.99, the system would again stabilize at 0.5, meaning that for this value of R, again, R being some number that reflects all the interacting components to the system behavior. And so for this value of R, the system would stabilize singularly at 0.5. Now, if we make the R equal to 3.1 with, with starting quote unquote state of 0.2, the system will stabilize between two values. When we further increase R to 3.49, the number of points at stability doubles from 2 to 4. So we can see that as the R increases, the system stability becomes more seemingly random. And another thing that happens is that it develops a sensitive dependence to initial conditions. So for example, if we started out with almost two identical initial conditions, let's say 0.2 and 0.200000001, which for sake of argument, let's imagine that that would translate to a 0.1% difference in starting cell number. And we were to make the R equal 4. The two trajectory of these hypothetical systems would more or less start out the same, but by time step number 30 or so, they start completely mismatching to the point that there's completely no correlation between the two. And this leads me to my first question. Where would a specific emergent phenomena that we are trying to recapitulate fall? As in other words, do some of these emergent phenomena that we study fall outside the time limit of predictability? And also, which of them are within the limit of predictability based on the current level of experimental accuracy? So basically, is there a specific phenomenon being studied right now that maybe emerges at time step 40, but because we have a system that would belong to, let's say, an R value of 4, we can actually only really predict up to 30, the time step 30. Now, before we bring this back to a more concrete and less conceptual discussion, I want to share one more aspect relating to the behavior of this logistical map. So by observing a bifurcation diagram like the one shown here, you can observe the value or values of X at which the system would stabilize with respect to the control parameter R. So basically for R values up to approximately 3, the system would stabilize at a single value. For R values from around 3 to around 3.5, there are 2X values. And it keeps doubling until you reach the chaotic region past 3.6. Meaning that we have arrived at the R values where predictability becomes impossible past a few time points ahead. And if we think about some of the parameters that we study as emerging phenomena, let's say strength production, walking speed, swimming speed, protease catalysis, or even the ones that are harder to quantify per se, such as morphogenesis or even neural network development, where would it lie in this diagram, and how far would the limit of predictability be at our current state? And I believe that we would benefit from finding ways to translate these concepts into the work that we do, whether in a conceptual way or actually finding ways to quantify it in our systems. So how would this look? Short answer is, well, honestly, I don't know. And I really think that we are far off from consolidating the mathematical concepts of dynamic systems theory into our current experimental platforms. But I do feel that our research field is perfectly placed to start introducing these concepts in our experimental design and interpretation of the results. And so here are some ponderings that I had relating to this concept. So for one, maybe we can start to see variance in our systems, assuming that we remove human error rather than a nuisance, but maybe as an emergent property itself. And if we look closer at the logistic map, we would quickly learn that it also follows some universal laws. And maybe we can think of ways to relate these laws to design principles that we can concretely use when designing our systems. And I also think that it's intuitive that one way to start doing this is by incorporating these concepts of dynamic systems theory in simulations. To trace it back to my own work, where we are trying to think about how to quantify neural network development and perhaps even learning, maybe start thinking about simulating neural circuits where we incorporate concepts of the logistic map to determine at what level of network complexity does the system become quote unquote chaotic. And furthermore, when considering about starting to design systems with the concept of where do they fall in the chaos diagram, we can start thinking about ways in which, at different stages of development of the system, we measure the variance of an emergent phenomena and sort of feed it back into the model to sort of determine where does the specific emergent property lie with respect to stability or chaos. And also to start thinking about possible models that would allow us to measure where is the limit of predictability and maybe be able to extend this limit by being able to determine by how much would we need to decrease the uncertainty in the initial conditions. And when talking about decreasing uncertainty, we can maybe see maybe see future automation as not only a way to remove variability, but maybe to be able to introduce it in a controlled fashion that to maybe help us develop models that would eventually allow us to predict and quantify emergence by seeing the deviations from the expected outcomes not as experimental failures, but an insight to the sensitivity of the initial conditions and the propensity of the system to be chaotic. And so, with that mouthful, I'll conclude, and hopefully, we'll get some feedback either online or offline on ideas or perspectives regarding some ways to quantify this complexity and the emergence in our systems. So, thanks.
Great. I just wanted to let everyone know that it is now we have time for Q&A. If anyone is muted, please just make sure you're not muted before you ask your questions. We have until 1:20 for this, so a couple of questions.
Gelson, this is Roger. Really an interesting way of looking at things, and I think a necessary way. But let me sort of turn on its head what you were just telling us. You're talking about going from a stable state to a chaotic state and generating chaos, and speaking of that as being analogous to emergent behaviors. But I think of emergent behaviors as almost being the opposite. I think of a collection of random cells coalescing into some more uniform state. So it's almost, by analogy, it's almost like a strange attractor as opposed to chaotic behavior. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think it's not so much that the system is chaotic itself, but rather that our ability, that the possibilities of the system might behave chaotic in the sense of if a small deviation in the initial conditions that we would normally ignore would result or impede our ability and develop deterministic models. So I still think, and the reason why I really liked this whole dynamic systems theory was that it still presents quote unquote chaos as still a very deterministic model. So technically, we are still talking about something that should arrive at a specific state of emergence. I'm more talking about that by looking in this perspective, we can maybe also assess our ability to predict that emergence. Sort of makes sense?
This is Ritu.
Yeah.
I have a comment, maybe something that I understood differently, Gelson, that maybe goes on with what Roger was saying, is something I was thinking about is we think of emergent behavior maybe as a stable state, but maybe it's one of 4 or 5 or 100 stable states that a multicellular system could end up in, and we don't know the frequency of any of those. So maybe mapping that frequency is something kind of more what you're saying along the lines of chaos.
Correct. Yes, that's exactly. Yeah, that's what it proposes. Correct. Thanks.
Okay. All right.